Hello, guys, welcome to Psyched Minds. If you have not subscribed yet to the channel, do subscribe, like, and share. We are currently reading We the Living by Anne Rand. This is going to be the last reading. We are on part 2, chapter 15. Andre had committed suicide. Ah. On the front pages of the Pravda, a square in a heavy black frame carried the words, "The Central Committee of the All Union Communist Party expresses its profound grief at the death of a heroic fighter of the revolution, former member of the Red Army, member of the party since 1915, Comrade Andrei Taganov." Under it, another square in a heavy black frame said, "The Leningrad Committee of the All Union Communist Party sorrowfully announces the death of Comrade Andrei Taganov. The funeral will take place tomorrow on the fields of victims of the revolution. The procession will start from the Smolny Institute at 10 o'clock in the morning." An editorial of the Pravda said, "Another name has been added to the glorious list of victims fallen on the field of honor of the revolution. The name may not be known to many, but it represents and symbolizes the common ranks of our party, the unsung heroes of our weekdays. In the person of Comrade Andrei Taganov, we pay a last tribute to the unknown warriors of the army of the proletariat. Comrade Taganov is dead. He committed suicide under the strain of a nervous collapse caused by overwork. His health and membership imposed upon his health and body were broken by the demanding, ceaseless task with which his party membership imposed upon him. Such was his sacrifice to the revolution, such is the sacrifice of a party that rules, not for the sake of personal loot and fame, like the rulers of capitalistic countries, but for the sake of assuming the hardest work, the most pitiless tasks in the service of the collective. And if in these days of struggle and privation, some of us may weaken in spirit, let us look up to the great All Union Communist Party that leads us, that spares not its strength, its energy, its lives. Let us make the red funeral of a party hero an occasion of tribute to our leaders. Let all toilers of Leningrad join in the process that will escort Comrade Taganov to his last place of rest." In an office of the GPU, a man with a smile that showed his gums said to Pavel Syrov, "Well, he gave us a good opportunity for a lot of useful noise after all. You making the opening speech?" "Yeah," said Syrov. "Don't forget his Red Army record and all that." "Well, I hope this will shut them up, those damn fools. Some of those old dotards of the 1905 vintage who showed an inclination to talk too much about his pre-October party card and over other things, the Kovalensky case among other things." "Forget it," said Pavel Syrov. The toilers of Leningrad marched behind a red coffin, row after row like walls, like the rungs of an endless ladder. They moved forward, swallowing Nevsky in the slow, rumbling, growing tide of bodies and banners, thousands of feet stepping in time, as if one gigantic pair of boots made Nevsky shudder in rhythm. From the statue of Alexander III to the columns of the Admiralty, thousands of human bodies marched gravely, flaming banners raised high in a last salute. Soldiers of the Red Army came as khaki ramparts, row after row of straight, husky shoulders, of boots firm and steady in the snow, of peaked caps with a red star on each forehead, and over them a red banner with gold letters, "Glory eternal to a fallen comrade." Workers of the Putilovsky factory came in grey, unbroken ranks, moving slowly under a red banner held high in sturdy fists. He came from the workers' ranks. He gave his life to the workers of the world. The proletariat thanks its fallen fighter. Students of the Technological Institute followed, rows of young, earnest faces, of grave, clear eyes, of straight, tan, taut bodies, of boys in black caps and girls in red kerchief, red as the banner that said, "The students of the Technological Institute are proud of their sacrifice to the cause of the revolution." Members of his party collective, rows of black leather jacket, marched gravely. Austere as monks, stately as warriors, their banner spread high and straight, without a wrinkle, a narrow red band with black letters, as sharp and plain as the men who carried it. The All Union Communist Party offers all and every one of its lives to the service of the world revolution. Every factory of Petrograd, every club, every office, every union, every small forgotten cell rolled in a single stream, grey, black, and red, through a single artery of the great city. 3 miles of caps and red kerchief and feet crunching snow and banners like red glasses in the mist, and the grey walls of Nevsky were like the sides of a huge canal where human waves played a funeral dirge on a snow hard as granite. It was cold. A piercing, motionless cold hung over the city, heavy as a mist that cut into the walls, into the cracks of sealed windows, into the bones and skins under the heavy clothes. The sky was torn into grey layers of rags, and clouds were smeared on, like patches of ink badly blotted, with a paler ink under them and a faded ink beneath, and then a water turbid with soap suds under which no blue could ever have existed. Smoke rose from old chimneys, grey as the cloud, as if that smoke had spread over the city, or the clouds had belched grey coils into the chimneys, and houses were spitting them back, and the smoke made the houses seem unheated. Snowflakes fluttered down lazily once in a while to melt on indifferent, moving foreheads. An open coffin was carried at the head of the procession. The coffin was red. A banner of scarlet, regal velvet was draped over a still body. A white face lay motionless on a red pillow, a clear, sharp profile swimming slowly past the grey walls, black strands of hair scattered on the red cloth, black strands of hair hiding a dark little hole on the right temple. The face was calm. Snowflakes did not melt on the still, white forehead. Four honorary pall bearer, his best party comrades, carried the coffin on their shoulders. Four bowed heads were bare to the cold. The coffin seemed very red between the blonde hair of Pavel Sirov and the black curls of Viktor Dunaev. A military band followed the coffin. The big brass tubes were trimmed with boughs of black creep. The band played You Fell as a Victim. Many years ago, in secret cellars hidden from the eyes of the Czar's gendarmes, on the frozen road of Siberian prison camps, a song had been born to the memory of those who had fallen in the fight for freedom. It was sung in muffled, breathless whispers to the clanking of chains in honor of nameless heroes. It traveled down dark side lanes. It had no author, and no copy of it had ever been printed. The revolution brought it into every music store window and into the roar of every band that followed a communist to his grave. The revolution brought the Internationale to its living, and You Fell as a Victim to its dead. It became the official funeral dirge of the new republic. The toilers of Leningrad sang solemnly, marching behind the open red coffin. You fell as a victim in our fateful fight, a victim of endless devotion. You gave all you had to the people you loved, your honor, your life, and your freedom. The music began with the majesty of that hopelessness which is beyond the need of hope. It mounted to an ecstatic cry, which was not joy nor sorrow, but a military salute. It fell, breaking into a pitiless tenderness, the reverent tenderness that honors a warrior without tears. It was a resonant smile of sorrow. And feet marched in the snow, and the brass tubes thundered, and brass cymbals compounded each step into the earth, and grey ranks unrolled upon grey ranks, and scarlet banners swayed to the grandeur of the song in a solemn farewell. The tyrant shall fall, and the people shall rise, sublime, almighty, unchained. So farewell, our brother, you have gallantly made your noble and valiant journey. Far beyond the rows of soldiers and students and workers in the ranks of nameless stragglers that carried no banners, a girl walked alone, her unblinking eyes fixed ahead, even though she was too far away to see the red coffin. Her hands hung limply by her sides. Above the heavy woolen mittens, her wrists were bare to the cold, frozen to a dark purplish red. Her face had no expression. Her eyes had. They seemed astonished. Those marching around her paid no attention to her. But at the start of the demonstration, someone had noticed her. Comrade Sonia, leading a detachment of women workers from the Zenotel, had hurried past to take her place at the head of the procession, where she had to carry a banner. Comrade Sonia had stopped short and chuckled aloud. Really, Comrade Argonova, you? Here? I should think you would be the one person to stay away. Kira Argonova had not answered. Some women in red kerchief had passed by. One had pointed at her and whispered something, eagerly, furtively, to her comrades. Someone had giggled. Kira walked slowly, looking ahead. Those around her sang, "You fell as a victim." She did not sing. A red banner said, "Proletarians of the world, unite." A freckled woman with strands of rusty hair under a man's cap whispered to her neighbor, "Mashka, did you get the buckwheat at the cooperative this week?" "No, they giving any?" "Yeah, £2 per card. Better get it before it's all gone." A red banner said, "Forward into the socialistic future under the leadership of Lenin's party." A woman hissed through blackened stumps of teeth, "Oh hell, they would choose a cold day like this to make us march in another one of their cursed parades. You fell as a victim in our fateful fight, a victim of endless devotion. Stood in line for 2 hours yesterday, but the best onions you ever hope to see. Donka, don't miss the sunflower seed oil at the cooperative. If they don't get shot by someone, they shoot themselves just to make us walk. You gave all you had for the people you loved," a red banner said. "Tighten the bonds of class solidarity under the standard of the Communist Party." God, I left soup cooking on the primus. It will boil all over the house. Stop scratching, comrade. Your honor, your life, and your freedom. Comrade, stop chewing sunflower seeds. It's disrespectful. It's like this, Praskovia. You peel the onions and add a dash of flour, just any flour you can get, and then a dash of linseed oil. And what do they have to commit suicide about? A red banner said, "The Communist Party spares no victims in its fight for the freedom of mankind. There's a little closet under the back stairs and some straws, and no one can hear us in there. My husband, the poor sap, will never get wise. Let the millet soak for a couple of hours before cooking. God, it's the 7th month. It is. And you can't expect me to have a figure like a matchstick. And here I have to walk like this. Yeah, it's my 5th one. That 30 rent shall fall and the people shall rise, sublime, almighty, unchained. Lord Jesus Christ, I bet the newspaper's grown fast to my skin. Ever use newspapers to keep your feet warm, comrade? Under the socks? Makes your feet stink. Cover your mouth when you yawn like that, comrade. Damn those demonstrations. Who the hell was he anyway? You gave all you had for the people you loved. The field of victims of the revolution was a huge square in the heart of the city. On the shore of the Neva, a vast, white desert, stretching for half a mile like a bald spot on the scalp of Petrograd. The iron lances of the summer garden fence stood on guard at one side of the field, and beyond them lay the white desolation of a park with bare trees that seemed made of black iron like the lances. Before the revolution, it had been called the Field of Mars, and long ranks of grey uniforms had crossed it in military drills. The revolution had erected a small square of rose granite slabs, a little island lost in the center of the field. Under the slabs were buried the first victims fallen in the streets of Petrograd in February of 1917. The days since February of 1917 had added more granite slabs to the little island. The names carved on the granite had belonged to those whose death had been the occasion for a demonstration, whose last reward had been the honor of the title of the revolution's victim. Pavel Sirov mounted a block of red granite over a red coffin. His slender figure in a tight new leather jacket and breeches and tall military boots stood sharply proudly against the grey sky. His blond hair waved in the wind, and his arms rose solemnly in blessing and exhortation over a motionless sea of heads and banners. "Comrades, Pavel Syrov's voice thundered over the solemn silence of thousands. We are here united by a common sorrow, by the common duty of paying a last tribute to a fallen hero. We have lost a great man, we have lost a great fighter. Perhaps I may be permitted to say that I feel the loss more keenly than many who join me in honoring his death, who knew him not while he lived. I was one of his closest friends, and it was a privilege which I must share with all of you. Andrei Taganov was not a famous man, but he bore proudly and gallantly one title, that of a communist. He came from the toiler's rank. His childhood was spent at the proletarian workbench. He and I, we grew up together, and together we shared the long years of toil in the Putilovsky factory. We joined the party together long before the revolution, in those dark days when a party card was a ticket to Siberia or a mark for the Czar's hangman's noose. Side by side, Comrade Taganov and I fought in the streets of this city in the glorious days of October 1917. Side by side, we fought in the ranks of the Red Army. And in the years of peace and reconstruction that followed our victory, the years which are harder and perhaps more heroic than any warfare, he did more than his share of the silent, modest, self sacrificing work which your party carries on for you, toilers of the USSR. He fell as a victim to that work. But our sorrow at his death shall also be joy at his achievements. He is dead, but his work, our work, goes on. The individual may fall, but the collective lives forever. Under the guidance of the Soviets, under the leadership of the great All Union Communist Party, we are marching into a radiant tomorrow when the honest toil of free toilers will rule the world. Then labor will no longer be slavery as it is in capitalistic countries, but a free and happy duty to that which is greater than our petty concerns, greater than our petty sorrows, greater than our very lives, the eternal collective of a proletarian society. Our glorious dead shall be remembered forever. But we are marching on. Andrei Taganov is dead, but we remain. Life and victory are ours. Ours is the future. The applause rolled like a thunder to the houses of the city far away, to the snow of the summer garden, and red banners waved in the roar of clapping hands rising to the grey sky. When the hands dropped and the heads turned their hands rising to the grey sky, when the hands dropped and the heads turned their eyes to the red granite slab, Comrade Syrov was gone, and against the grey sky stood the trim, proud, resolute figure of Viktor Dunayev, black curls waving in winds, eyes sparkling, mouth open wide over lustrous white teeth, throwing into the silence the clear, ringing notes of a young, powerful voice. Comrade workers, thousands of us are gathered here to honor one man, but one man means nothing in the face of the mighty proletarian collective. No matter how worthy his achievements, we would not be here if that man were not more than a single individual, if he were not a symbol of something greater, which we are gathered here to honor. This is not a funeral, comrades, but a birthday party. We are not celebrating the death of a comrade, but the birth of a new humanity. Of that new humanity, he was one of the first, but not the last. The Soviet comrades are creating a new race of men. The new race terrifies the old world, for it brings death to all its outworn standards. What then are the standards of our new humanity? The first and basic one is that we have lost a word from our language, the most dangerous, the most insidious, the most evil of the human words, the word I. We have outgrown it. We is the slogan of the future. The collective stands in our heart where the old monster, self, had stood. We have risen beyond the worship of the pocketbook of personal power and personal vanity. We do not long for gold chains and gold medals. Our only badge of honor is the honor of serving the collective. Our only aim is the honest toil which profits not one but all. What is the lesson we are to learn here today and to teach our enemies beyond the borders? The lesson of a party comrade dying for the collective. The lesson of a party that rules but to sacrifice itself to those it rules. Look at the world around you, comrades. Look at the fat, slobbering ministers of the capitalistic countries who fight and stab one another in the back of their bloody scramble for power. Then look at those who rule you, who consecrate their lives to the unselfish service of the collective, who carry the tremendous responsibility of the dictatorship of the proletariat. If you do, you will understand me when I say that the All Union Communistic Party is the only honest, fearless, idealistic body of men in the politics of the world today. The applause thundered as if the old cannons of the Peter Paul fortress across the river had been fired all at once, and it thundered again when Victor's black curls disappeared in the crowd and the straight, stubby name of Comrade Sonia waved high in the air while she roared with all the power of her broad chest about the new duties of the new woman of the proletariat. Then another face rose over the crowd, a thin, consumptive, unshaped face that wore glasses and opened a pale mouth wide, coughing words which no one could hear. Then another mouth spoke, and it could be heard far beyond the crowd, a mouth that bellowed sonorously through a thick black beard. A freckled boy from the Communist Union of Youth spoke, stuttering, scratching his head. A tall spinster in a crumpled, old fashioned hat spoke ferociously, opening her mouth as if she were at the dentist's, shaking her thin figure at the crowd as at a schoolroom of the disobedient pupils. A tall sailor spoke, his fist on his hips, and those in the back rows laughed occasionally when they heard the front rows laughing, even though the words did not reach them. Thousands stood, fidgeting nervously, knocking their heels together to keep them warm, burying their hands in their armpits, in their sleeves, in their fur lapels, breathing little wet icicles on the old scarfs high under their noses. They looked they took turns in holding the red banners, and those who held them pressed the poles tightly to their sides with their elbow, blowing on their frozen fingers. A few sneaked away, hurrying furtively down the side streets. Kira Argonova stood without moving and listened attentively. She listened to every word. Her eyes held a question she hoped the world could answer. Over the vast field, the sky was turning a dark, dirty greyish blue, and in a window far away from the first little yellow spark of light twinkled, greeting the early winter dusk. The voice of the last speaker had died, smothered in the thick mist of frost which one could not see, but felt flowing down heavily from the darkness above. The red coffin had been closed and had disappeared in the earth, and the grave had been filled, and a slab of red granite had risen over it. And suddenly the grey sea had shuddered, and the ranks were broken, and dark streams of men rolled swiftly into side streets as if a dam had burst open. And far away, dying in the frozen twilight, the military band struck up an internationale, the song of the living, like the marching of thousands of feet, measured and steady, like soldiers' feet drumming a song upon the earth. Then Kira Argonova walked slowly towards the new grave. The field was empty, the sky was descending, locking a frozen blue vault over the city. Through a crack in the vault, a single steely dot twinkled feebly. The houses far away were not houses any longer, but flat, broken shadows of thin black paper pasted in a narrow strip against a brownish glow that had been red. Little lights trembled in little holes pierced through the paper. The field was not in a city. The empty, quiet silence of a countryside hung over a white desert where whirls of snow rose in the wind, melting into thin white powder. A lonely little figure stood over a granite tombstone. Snowflakes fluttered lazily down on her bowed head, on the lashes of her eyes. Her lashes glistened with snowflakes, but without tears. She looked at the words cut into the red granite: Glory eternal to the victims of the revolution, Andrei Taganov, 1896 to 1925. She wondered whether she had killed him, or the revolution had, or both. That brings us to the end of chapter 15. We'll be continuing with chapter 16. Chapter 16, part 2. Leo sat alone by the fireplace, smoking. A cigarette hung limply in his hand, then slipped out of his fingers. He did not notice it. He took another cigarette and held it unlighted for a long time, not noticing it. Then he glanced around for a match and could not find it, even though the box lay on the arm of his chair. Then he picked up the matchbox and stared at it, puzzled, for he had forgotten what he wanted. He had spoken little in the past 2 weeks. He had kissed Kira violently, once in a while, too violently, and she had felt his effort, and she had avoided his lips and his arms. He had left home often, and she had never asked him where he went. He had been drinking too often and too much, and she had not said whether she noticed it. When they had been alone together, they had sat silently, and the silence had spoken to her louder than any word of something which was an end. He had been spending the last of their money, and she had not questioned him about the future. She had not questioned him about anything, for she had been afraid of the answer. She knew that her fight was lost. When Kira came home from the funeral, Leo did not rise to his feet, but sat by the fireplace, not moving. He looked at her with a slow, curious, heavy glance between heavy eyelids. Silently, she took off her coat and hung it in her wardrobe. She was taking off her hat when a sound made her turn. Leo was laughing. It was a hard, bitter, brutal laughter. She looked at him, her eyes wide. Leo, what's the matter? He asked her fiercely. Don't you know? She shook her head. Well then, he asked, do you want to know how much I know? How much you know about what, Leo? I don't suppose this is a good time to tell you, is it? Right after your lover's funeral? My. He rose and approached her and stood, his hands in his pocket, looking down at her with the arrogantly contemptuous look she worshipped. With the scornful, drooping smile, but his arched lips moved slowly to form 3 words. You little bitch. She stood straight without moving, her face white. Leo. Shut up. I don't want to hear a sound out of you. You rotten little. I wouldn't mind it if you were like the rest of us, but you, with your saintly airs and with your heroic speeches, trying to make me walk straight while you were rolling under the first communist bum who took the trouble to push you. Leo, who? Shut up. No, I'll give you the chance to speak. I'll give you a chance to answer just one word. Were you Taganov's mistress? Were you? Yes or no? Yes. All the time I was away? Yes. And all the time since I came back? Yes. What else did they tell you, Leo? What else did you want them to tell me? Nothing. He looked at her. His eyes were suddenly cold, clear, weary. Who told you, Leo? A friend of yours? Of his? Our dear comrade, Pavel Syrov. He dropped in on his way back from the funeral. He just wanted to congratulate me on the loss of my rival. Was it? Was it a hard blow to you, Leo? It was the best piece of news I had heard since the revolution. We shook hands and had a drink together, Comrade Syrov and I. Drank to you and your lover and any other lovers you may have, because you see that sets me free. Free from what, Leo? From a little fool, who was my last hold on self esteem. A little fool I was afraid to face, afraid to hurt. Really, it's funny. You and your communist hero. I thought he had lied, making a great sacrifice by saving me for you. And he was just tired of you. He probably wanted to get you off his hands for some other whore. So much for the sublime in the human race. Leo, we don't have to discuss him, do we? Still love him? That doesn't make any difference to you, now does it? None. None whatever. I won't even ask whether you had ever loved me. That too doesn't make any difference. I would rather think you hadn't. That will make it easier for the future. The future, Leo? Well, what did you plan it to be? Oh, I know. Get a respectable Soviet job and rot over a primus and a ration card and keep wholly something in your fool imagination, your spirit or soul or honor, something that never existed, that shouldn't exist. That is the worst of all curses if it ever did exist. Well, I'm through with it. If it's murder, well, I don't see any blood, but I'm going to have champagne and white bread and silk shirts and limousines and no thoughts of any kind, and long live the dictatorship of the proletariat. Leo, what are you going to do? I'm going away. Where? Sit down. He sat down at the table. His one hand lay in the circle of light under the lamp, and she noticed how still and white it was, with the net of blue veins that did not seem alive. She stood watching it until one finger moved. Then she down. Her face was expressionless, her eyes were a little wide. He noticed her lashes, little needles of shadow on her cheeks, and the lashes were dry. Citizen Morozov, said Leo, has left town. Well, he's left Tonia. He wants no connection that could be investigated, but he's left her a nice little sum of money. Oh, quite nice. She's going for a rest and vacation in Caucasus. She has asked me to go with her. I've accepted the job. Leo Kovalinsky, the great gigolo of the USSR. Leo. She stood before him and he saw terror in her eyes. Such naked, raw terror that he opened his mouth but could not laugh. Leo, not that. She's an old bitch, I know. I like it better that way. She has the money and she wants me. Just a business deal. Leo, you like a. Don't bother about the names. You can't think of any as good as the ones I have thought of myself. He noticed that the folds of her dress were shivering and that her hands were flung back unnaturally as if leaning on space, and he asked, rising, "You're not going to be fool enough to faint, are you?" She said, drawing her shoulders together. "No, of course not. Sit down. I'm all right." She sat on the edge of the table, her hands clutching it tightly, and she looked at him. His eyes were dead, and she turned away, for she felt that those eyes should be closed. She whispered, "Leo, if you had been killed in the GPU, or if you had sold yourself to some magnificent woman, a foreigner, a young and fresh, and I wouldn't sell myself to a magnificent woman, young and fresh. I couldn't. Not yet. In a year, I probably will." He rose and looked at her and laughed softly, indifferently. "Really, don't you think it's not for you to express any depths of moral indignation? And since we both are what we are, would you mind telling me just why you kept me on while you had him? Just like to sleep with me? Like all the other females? Or was it my money and his position?" Then she rose and stood very straight, very still, and asked, "Leo, when did you tell her that you would go with her?" 3 days ago. Before you knew anything about Andre and me? Yes. While you still thought that I loved you? Yes. And that made no difference to you? No. If Cyrov had not come here today, you would still go with her? Yes, only then I would have to face the problem of telling you. He spared me that. That's why I was glad to hear it. Now we can say goodbye without any unnecessary scenes. Leo, please listen carefully. It's very important. Please do me a last favor and answer this one question honestly, to the best of your knowledge. If you were to learn suddenly, it doesn't matter how, but if you were to learn that I love you, that I've always loved you, that I've been loyal to you all these years, would you still go with her? Yes. And if you had to stay with me, if you learned something that bound you to stay and to struggle on, would you try it once more? If I were bound to, well, who knows? I might do what your other lover did. That's also a solution. I see. And why do you ask that? What is there to bind me? She looked straight at him, her face raised to his, and her hair fell back off a very white forehead, and only her lips moved as she answered with the greatest calm of her life. Nothing, Leo. He sat down again and clasped his hands and stretched them out, shrugging. Well, that's that. Really, I still think you're wonderful. I was afraid of the hysterics and a lot of noise. It's ended as it should have ended. I'm leaving in 3 days. Until then, I can move out of here if you want me to. No, I would rather go tonight. Why tonight? I would rather. I can share Lydia's room for a while. I haven't much money left, but what there is, I want you to know. But please don't. I'll take my clothes. That's all I need. She was packing a suitcase, her back turned to him, when he asked suddenly, "Aren't you going to say anything? Have you nothing to say?" She turned and looked at him calmly and answered, "Only this, Leo. It was I against 150 million people. I lost." When she was ready to go, he rose and asked suddenly, involuntarily, "Kira, you loved me once, didn't you?" She answered, "When a person dies, one does not stop loving him, does one?" "Do you mean Taganov or me? Does it make any difference, Leo?" "No." "May I help you to carry the suitcase downstairs?" "No, thank you. It's not heavy. Goodbye, Leo." He took her hand and his face moved down hers, but she shook her head and he only said, "Goodbye, Kira." She walked out into the street, leaning slightly to her left, her right arm pulled down by the weight of the suitcase. A frozen fog hung like cotton over the street, and a lamppost made a sickly yellow blot spilled in the fog. She straightened her shoulders and walked slowly, and the white earth cracked under her feet, and the line of her chin was parallel with the earth, and the line of her glance parallel with her chin. To her family, three silent, startled faces, Kira explained quietly, and Galina Petrovna gasped, "But what happened to—" "Nothing. We are just tired of each other." "My poor dear child, I—" "Please don't worry about me, mother. If you will forgive me the inconvenience, Lydia, it will be only for a little while. I couldn't have found another room for just a few weeks." "Why, certainly. Why, I'll be only too glad to have you, Kira, after all you have done for us. But why for a few weeks? Why are you going after that?" She answered, and her voice had the intensity of a maniac's. "Abroad." On the following morning, citizen Kira Argonova filed an application for a foreign passport. She had several weeks to wait for an answer. Galina Petrovna moaned, "It's insanity, Kira. Sheer insanity. In the first place, they won't give it to you. You have no reasons to show why you want to go abroad and with your father's social past and all. And even if you don't get the passport, then what? No foreign country will admit a Russian, and I can't say that I blame them. And if they admit you, what are you going to do? Have you thought of that?" "No," said Kira. "You have no money, you have no profession. How are you going to live?" "I don't know." "What will happen to you?" "I don't care." "But why are you doing it?" "I want to get out." "But you'll be all alone, lost in a wide world, with not a—" "I want to get out." "With not a single friend to help you, with no aim, with no future, no—" "I want to get out." On the evening of his departure, Leo came to say goodbye. Lydia left them alone in her room. Leo said, "I couldn't go, Kira, after parting as we did. I wanted to say goodbye, and unless you would rather—" She said, "No, I'm glad you came. I wanted to apologize for some of the things I said to you. I had no right to say them. It's not up to me to blame you. Will you forgive me?" "It's all right, Leo. I have nothing to forgive. I wanted to tell you that, well, no, there's nothing to tell you. Only that we have great deal to remember, haven't we?" "Yes, Leo." "You'll be better off without me?" "Don't worry about me, Leo. I'll be back in Petrograd. We'll meet again. We'll meet when the years have passed, and years make such a difference, don't they?" "Yes, Leo. Then we won't have to be so serious anymore. It will be strange to look back, won't it? We'll meet again, Kira. I'll be back. If you are still alive, and if you don't forget." It was as if she had kicked a dead animal in the road and saw it jerking in a last convulsion. He whispered, "Kira, don't—" But she knew it was only a last convulsion, and she said, "I won't." He kissed her, and her lips were soft and tender and yielding to his. Then he went. She had several weeks to wait. In the evenings, Alexander Dmitrievich came home from work and shook snow off his galoshes in the lobby and wiped them carefully with a special rag, for the galoshes were new and expensive. After dinner, when he had no meeting to attend, he sat in a corner with an unpainted wooden screen frame and worked patiently, passing pasting matchbox labels on the frame. He collected the labels and guarded them jealously in a locked box. At night, he spread them cautiously on the table and moved them slowly into patterns, trying out color combinations. He had a whole panel completed and he muttered, squinting at it appraisingly, "It's a beauty, a beauty. I bet no one in Petrograd has anything like it. What do you think, Ira? Shall I use two yellow ones and a green one in this corner or just three yellows?" She answered quietly, "The green one will be nice, father." Galina Petrovna thundered in at night and flung a heavy briefcase on a chair in the lobby. She had had a telephone installed and she tore the receiver off the hook and spoke hurriedly, still removing her gloves, unbuttoning her coat. "Comrade Fedorov, Comrade Argonova speaking. I have an idea for that number in the living newspaper for our next club show. Now, when we present Lord Chamberlain crushing the British proletariat, we'll have one of the pupils, a good husky one, wearing a red blouse, lie down on the floor and we'll put a table on him. Oh, just the front legs, and we'll have the fat one playing Lord Chamberlain in a high silk hat, sit at the table and eat steak. Oh, it doesn't have to be a real steak, just papier mache." Galina Petrovna ate her dinner hurriedly, reading the evening paper. She jumped up, looking at the clock. Before she had finished, dabbed a smear of powder on her nose and, seizing her briefcase, rushed out again to a council meeting. On the rare evenings when she stayed at home, she spread books and newspaper clippings over the dining room table and sat writing a thesis for her Marxist club. She asked, raising her head, blinking absent-mindedly, "Kira, do you happen to know the Paris Commune? What year was that?" 1871, mother, Kira answered quietly. Lydia worked at night. In the daytime, she practiced the Internationale, and you fell as a victim and the Red Cavalry song on her old grand piano that had not been turned for over a year. When she was asked to play the old classics she loved, she refused flatly, her mouth set in a thin, foolish, stubborn line. But once in a while she sat down at the piano suddenly and played for hours, fiercely, violently, without stopping between pieces. She played Chopin and Bach and Tchaikovsky, and when her fingers were numb, she cried, sobbing aloud in broken hiccoughs, senselessly, monotonously, like a child. Galina Petrovna paid no attention to it, saying, "Just another one of Lydia's fits." Kira was lying on her mattress on the floor when Lydia came home from work. Lydia took a long time to undress and a longer time to whisper endless prayers before the icons of in her corner. Some evenings she came over to Kira and sat down on the mattress and, shivering in the darkness in her long white nightgown, her hair falling in a thick braid down her back, whispered confidentially, a ray of the street lamp beyond the window falling on her tired face with swollen eyes and dry little wrinkles in the corner of the mouth, on her dry, knotty hands that did not look young any longer. "I had a vision again, Kira, a call from above. Truly a power, truly a prophetic vision. And the voice told me that salvation shall not be long in coming. It is the end of the world and the reign of the Antichrist, but Judgment Day is approaching, I know. It had been revealed to me," she whispered feverishly. She expected nothing but a peal of laughter from her sister. She was not looking at Kira. She was not certain whether Kira heard it, but she had to talk and she had to think that some human ears were listening. "There is an old man, Kira, God's wanderer. I've been to see him. Please don't mention this to anyone or they will fire me from the club. He is the chosen one of the Lord and he knows. He says it has been predicted in the scriptures. We are punished for our sins as Sodom and Gomorrah were punished, but hardships and sorrows are only a trial for the soul of the righteous. Only through suffering and long bearing patience shall we become worthy of the kingdom of heaven." Kira said quietly, "I won't tell anyone, Lydia. And now you'd better go to bed because you're tired and it's so cold here." In the daytime, Kira led excursions through the Museum of the Revolution. In the evening, she sat in the dining room and read old books. She spoke seldom. When anyone addressed her, she answered evenly, quietly. Her voice seemed frozen on a single note. Galina Petrovna wished uncomfortably to see her, angry at least once. She did not see it. One evening, when Lydia dropped a vase in the silence of the dining room and it broke with a crash, and Galina Petrovna jumped up with a startled little scream, and Alexander Dmitrievich shuddered, blinking. Kira raised her head slowly as if nothing had happened. But there was a flicker of life in her eyes when, on her way home from the excursion center, she stopped at the window of a foreign bookstore of Litany and stood looking through thoughtfully at the bright covers with gay, broken foreign letters, with chorus girls kicking long, glistening legs, with columns and searchlights, and long black automobiles. There were a jerk of life in her fingers when every evening, as methodically as a good bookkeeper, with a dull little stub of a pencil, she crossed another date off an old calendar on the wall over her mattress. The foreign passport was refused. Kira received the news with a quiet indifference that frightened Galina Petrovna, who would have preferred a stormy outbreak. Listen, Kira, said Galina Petrovna vehemently, slamming the door of her room to be left alone with her daughter. Let's talk sense. If you have any insane idea of now, I want you to know that I won't permit it. After all, you are my daughter. I have some say in the matter. You know what it means if you attempt, if you even dare to think of leaving the country illegally. I've never mentioned that, said Kira. No, you haven't, but I know you. I know what you are thinking. I know how far your foolish recklessness can. Listen, it's 100 to 1 that you don't get out, and you'll be lucky if you are just shot at the border. It will be worse if you are caught and brought back. And if you are lucky enough to draw the one chance and slip out, it's 100 to 1 that you will die in a blizzard in those forests around the border. Mother, why discuss it? Listen, I'll keep you here if I have to chain you. After all, one can be allowed to be crazy just so far. What are you after? What is wrong with this country? We don't have any luxuries, that's true, but you won't get any up over there either. A chambermaid is all you can hope to be there if you are lucky. This is the country for young people. I know your crazy stubbornness, but you will get over it. Look at me. I have adapted myself at my age, and really, I can't say that I'm unhappy. You are only a pup and you can't make decisions to ruin your whole life before you have even started it. You'll outgrow your foolish notions. There is a chance for everyone in this new country of ours. Mother, I'm not arguing, am I? So let's drop the subject. Kira returned home later than usual from her excursions. There were people she had to see in the dark streets, slipping furtive up dark stairs through unlighted doorways. There were bills to be slipped into stealthy hands and whispers to be heard from lips close to her ear. It would cost more than she could ever save to be smuggled out on a boat. She learned, and it would be more dangerous. She had a better chance if she had tried it alone, on foot, across the Latvian border. She would need white clothes, people had done it, dressed all in white, crawling through the snow in the white winter darkness. She sold her watch and paid for the name of the station in the village, and for a square inch of tissue paper with the map of the place where a crossing was possible. She sold the fur coat Leo had given her and paid for a forged permit to travel. She sold her cigarette lighter, her silk stockings, her French perfume. She sold all her new shoes and her dresses. Vava Milovskaya came to buy the dresses. Vava waddled in, shuffling heavily in worn out felt boots. Vava's dress had a greasy patch across the chest, and her matted hair looked uncombed. Her face was puffed, a coarse white powder had dried in patches on her nose, and her eyes were uncircled in heavy blue bags. When she took off her clothes slowly, awkwardly to try on the dresses, Lydia noticed a swelling at her once slender waistline. Wawa, darling, what already? Lydia gasped. Yes, said Wawa indifferently. I'm going to have a baby. Oh, darling, oh, congratulations. Lydia clasped her hands. Yes, said Wawa. I'm going to have a baby. I have to be careful about eating and I take a walk every day. When it's born, we are going to register it with the pioneers. Oh no, Wawa. Oh, why not? Why not? It has to have a chance, doesn't it? It has to go to school and to the university, maybe. What do you want me to do? Bring it up as an outcast? Oh, what's the difference? Who knows who's right? I don't know anymore. I don't care. But Wawa, your child. Lydia, what's the use? I'll get a job offer after it's born. I'll have to. Kolya is working. It will be the child of Soviet employees. Then later, maybe they will admit it into the Communist Union of Youth. Kira, that black velvet dress. It's so lovely. It looks almost foreign. I know it's too tight for me now, but afterwards, maybe I'll get my figure back. They say you do. Of course, Kolya isn't making very much, and I don't want to take anything from father. And but father gave me a present for my birthday, 50 rubles, and I think I should. I could never buy anything like it anywhere. She bought the velvet dress and two others. To Galina Petrovna, Kira had explained, "I don't need those dresses. I don't go anywhere, and I don't like to keep them." Memories? Galina Petrovna had asked. Yes, Kira had said. Memories. She did not have much money after everything was sold. She knew that she would need every ruble. She could not buy a white coat, but she had the white beer rug that she had brought from Vasily Ivanovich long ago. She took it secretly to a tailor and ordered it made into a coat. The coat came out as a short jacket that did not reach down to her knees. She would need a white dress. She could not buy one, but she still had Galina Petrovna's white lace wedding gown. When she was alone at home, she took her old felt boots into the kitchen and painted them with white with lime. She bought a pair of white mittens and a white woolen scarf. She bought a ticket to a town far out of the way, far from the Latvian border. When everything was ready, she sewed her little roll of money into the linen of the lining of the white fur jacket. She would need it there if she crossed the border. On a grey winter afternoon, she left the house when no one was at home. She did not say goodbye. She left no letter. She walked down the stairs and out into the street as if she were going to the corner store. She wore an old coat with a matted fur collar. She carried a small suitcase. The suitcase contained a white fur jacket and a wedding gown, a pair of boots, a pair of mittens, a scarf. She walked to the station. A brownish mist hung over the rooftops, and men walked bent to the wind, huddled, their hands in their armpits. A white frost glazed the posters, and the bronze cupolas of churches were dimmed in a silvery grey. The wind whirled little coils in the snow, and kerosene lamps stood in store windows, melting streaks on the frozen white panes. Kira, a voice called softly on a corner. She turned. It was Vasily Ivanovich. He stood under a lamppost, hunched, the collars of his old coat raised to his red ears, an old scarf twisted around his neck, two leather straps slung over his shoulders, holding a tray of saccharine tubes. Good evening, Uncle Vasily. Where are you going, Kira, with that suitcase? How have you been, Uncle Vasily? I'm all right, child. It may seem a strange business to find me, I know, but it's all right. Really, it's not as bad as it looks. I don't mind it at all. Why don't you come to see us? Sometimes, Kira. I. It's not a grand place, ours, and there's another family in the same room, but we're getting along. Ashia will be glad to see you. We don't have many visitors. Ashia is a nice child. Yes, Uncle Vasily. It's such a joy to watch her growing, day by day. She's getting better at school too. I help her with the lessons. I don't mind standing here all day because then I go home and there she is. Everything isn't lost yet. I still have Ashia's future before me. Ashia is a bright child. She'll go far. Yes, Uncle Vasily. I read the papers too when I have time. There's a lot going on in the world. One can wait if one has faith and patience. Uncle Vasily, I'll tell them over there where I'm going. I'll tell them about everything. It's like an SOS, and maybe someone somewhere will understand. Child, where are you going? Will you sell me a tube of saccharine, Uncle Vasily? Why, no, I won't sell it to you. Take it, child, if you need it. Certainly not. I was going to buy it anyway from someone else. She lied. Don't you want me for a customer? It may bring you luck. All right, child. I'll take this nice big one with the brick crystals. Here you are. She slipped the coin into his hand and tube of saccharine into her pocket. Well, goodbye, Uncle Vasily. Goodbye, Kira. She walked away without looking back. She walked through the dusk, through grey and white streets, under greyish banners bending down from old walls, greyish banners that had been red. She walked through a wide square where the tramway lights twinkled, springing out of the mist. She walked up the frozen steps of the station without looking back. That brings us to the end of chapter 16, and this is the last chapter now, chapter 17 of part 2. The train wheels knocked as if an iron chain were jerked twice, then rumbled dully, clicking, then gave two sharp broken jerks again. The wheels tapped like an iron clock, ticking swiftly, knocking off seconds and minutes and miles. Kira Argonova sat on a wooden bench by the window. She had her suitcase on her lap and held it with both hands, her fingers spread wide apart. Her head leaned back against the wooden seat and trembled in a thin little shudder, like the dusty glass pane. Her lids drooped heavily over her eyes fixed on the window. She did not close her eyes. She sat for hours without moving, and her muscles did not feel the immobility, or she did not feel her muscles any longer. Beyond the window, nothing moved in the endless stretches of snow but black smears of telegraph poles, as if the train were suspended, stationary between two slices of white and grey, and the wheels shrieked as if grating in a void. Once in a while, a white blot on a white desert, a blot with black edges shaped as fir branches, sprang up suddenly beyond the window and whirled like lightning across the pane. When she remembered that she had not eaten for a long time, dimly uncertain whether it was hours or days, dimly conscious that she had to eat, even though she had forgotten hunger, she broke a chunk of a stale loaf of bread, which she had brought at the station, and chewed it slowly, with effort, her jaws moving monotonously like a machine. Around her, men left the car when the train stopped at stations and came back with steaming tea kettles. Once someone put a cup into her hand and she drank, the hot tin edge pressed to her lips. Telegraph wires raced the trains, crossing and parting and crossing again, thin black threads flying faster, faster than the shuddering car could follow. In the daytime, the sky seemed lighter than the earth, a pale stretch of translucent grey over a heavy white. At night, the earth seemed lighter than the sky, a pale blue band under a black void. She slept, sitting in her corner, her head on her arms on her suitcase. She tied the suitcase handle to her wrist with a piece of string at night. There were many moans around her about stolen luggage. She slept, her consciousness frozen on a single thought of her suitcase. She awakened with a jolt whenever the motion of the car made the suitcase slip a little. She had no thoughts left. She felt empty, clear, and quiet, as if her body were only an image of her will, and her will only an arrow, tense and hard, pointing at a border that had to be crossed. The only living thing she felt was the suitcase on her lap. Her will was knocking with the wheels of the train, her heart beat there, under the floor. She noticed dimly once on the bench before her a woman pressed a cold white breast into a child's lips. There still were people and there still were lives. She was not dead. She was only waiting to be born. At night she sat for hours. Staring at the window, she could see nothing but the dim reflection of the candle glow and benches and boarded walls, shuddering in spaces, and the tousled shadow of her own head. There was no earth, no world beyond the window, only far down by the track yellow squares of snow raced the train in the glow of the windows, and black clots whirled past as long, thin streaks. Once in a while, a spark of light pierced the darkness somewhere far away at the edge of the sky and brought suddenly into existence a blue waste of snow beyond the glass. The light died and the earth went with it, leaving nothing in the window but the boarded walls and the candle and the tousle head. There were stations where she had to get out and stand at a ticket window on a wind-swept platform and buy a new ticket and wait for another train to come, rushing through the dusk, a black engine spewing showers of red sparks. Then there were wheels again, knocking under the floor, and another station and another ticket and another train. There were many days and nights, but she did not notice them. The men in khaki peaked caps who examined the tickets could not know that the girl in the old coat with the matted fur collar was going towards the Latvian border. The last station where she did not buy another ticket was a dark little platform of rotted wooden planks, the last stop before the train's terminal before the border town. It was getting dark. Brown wheel tracks in the snow led far away into a glowing red patch. A few sleepy soldiers on the platform paid no attention to her. A large wicker hamper rattled as husky fists lowered it to the ground from a baggage car. At the station door, someone begged loudly for hot water. Lights twinkled in the car windows. She walked away, clutching her suitcase, following the wheel tracks in the snow. She walked, a slender black figure, leaning faintly backward, alone in a vast field, rusty in the sunset. It was dark when she saw the village houses ahead and yellow dots of candles in window low over the ground. She knocked at the door. A man opened it. His hair and beard were a bushy blonde tangle from which two bright eyes peered inquisitively. She slipped a bill into his hand and tried to explain as fast as she could in a choked whisper. She did not have to explain much. Those in the house knew and understood. Behind a low wooden partition, her feet in the straw where two pigs slept, huddled together, she changed her clothes. While those in the room sat around the table as if she were not present, five blonde heads, one of them in a blue kerchief, wooden spoons knocked in the wooden bowls on the table, and the sound of another spoon came from the shelf of a brick stove in the corner, and three little red tongues flickered before a bronze triangle of icons in a corner, little glimmers of red in the bronze halos. She put on the white boots and took off her dress. Her naked arms shuddered a little, even though the room was hot and stuffy. She put on the white wedding gown, and its long train rustled in the straw, and a pig opened one slit of an eye. She lifted the train and pinned it carefully to her waistline. With big safety pins, she wound the white scarf tightly around her hair and put on the white fur jacket. She cautiously caught the she felt cautiously the little lump in the lining over her left breast where she had sewn the bills. It was the last and only weapon she would need. When she approached the table, the blond giant said, his voice expressionless, "Better wait for an hour or so till the moon sets. The clown ain't so steady." He moved, making room for her on the bench, pointing to it silently, imperatively. She raised the lace dress, stepped over the bench, and sat down. She took off the jacket and held it over her arms, pressed tightly to her body. Two pairs of feminine eyes stared at her high lace collar, and the girl in the blue kerchief whispered something to the older woman, her eyes odd, incredulous. Silently, the man put a steaming wooden bowl before the guest. "No, thank you," she said. "I'm not hungry." "Eat," he ordered. "You will need it." She ate obediently a thick cabbage soup that smelled of hot lard. The man said suddenly in the silence without looking at her, "It's pretty near a whole night's walk." She nodded. "Pretty young," said the woman across the table, shaking her head and sighed. When she was ready to go, the man opened the door to a cold wind whining over an empty darkness and muttered in his blond beard, "Walk as long as you can. When you see a guard, crawl." "Thank you," she said as the door closed. Snow rose to her knees, and each step was like a fall forward, and she held her skirt high, clutched in her fist. Around her, a blue that did not seem blue, a color that was no color, that had never existed in the world she had known, stretched without end, and sometimes she thought she was standing alone, very tall, very high over a flat circle, and sometimes she thought the bluish whiteness was a huge wall closing in over her head. The sky hung low in grayish patches and black patches and streaks of a blue that one could never remember in the daytime, and blots of something which was not a color and not a quite a little ray, quite a light ray, flowed from nowhere, trickling once in a while among the clouds, and she bent her head not to see it. There were no lights ahead. She knew that the lights behind her had long since vanished, even though she did not look back. She would need nothing there ahead but the little roll in the lining of her jacket, and she touched it cautiously once in a while. Her knees hurt with the piercing pain of stretched sinews, and as if she were climbing a long stairway. She watched the pain a little curiously, like an outsider. Scalding needles pierced her cheeks and they itched, and she scratched them once in a while with a white mitten, but it did not help. She heard nothing but the rustle of the snow under her boots, and she tried to walk faster, not to listen beyond the sound of her feet, not to notice the slurred shadows of sounds hanging around her, floating from nowhere. She knew she had been walking for hours, which she had once called hours. There were no hours here. There were only steps, only legs rising and falling deep into the snow, and a snow that had no end. Or had it an end? That really did not matter. She did not have to think of that. She had to think only that she had to walk. She had to walk west. That was the only problem. That was the total of all the problems. Had she any problems? Had she any questions to be answered? If she had, they would be answered. There. She did not have to think. She had to get out. She would think then if there were thoughts to be faced, only she had to get out. Only to get out. In the white mittens, her fingers ached, her bone drawn tight, her joints squeezed as in a vice. She must be cold, she thought. She wondered dimly whether it was a very cold night. Before her, the blue snow was luminous, the snow lightening the sky. There were nothing but a haze ahead of her, where the earth was smeared into the clouds. And she was not sure whether the clouds were close to her face and she would knock against them or many miles away. She had nothing left behind. She had left nothing behind. She was walking out of void, a void wide and unreal as that earth around her. She could not give up. She still had them, those two legs that could move, and something lost somewhere within her that told them to move. She would not give up. She was alive and alone in a desert with which was not a living earth. She had to walk because she was still alive. She had to get out. Long spirals of snow rose in the wind, brushing the low sky. Far ahead, she saw strips of a shiny black above her and specks of bright dust twinkling at her from between the clouds. She huddled tighter, hunching her shoulders. She did not want to be seen. Something hurt in her waistline, if, as if each step jerked her spine forward, and something throbbed, rising up her back. She pressed her fingers to the roll in her jacket. She had to watch that. She could not lose it. She had to watch that and her legs. The rest did not matter. She stopped short when she saw a tree, the long white pyramid of a giant fir, rising suddenly out of the snow, and she stood without breath, her knees bent, crouching like an animal listening. She heard nothing. Nothing moved behind the low branches. She went on. She did not know how long she had waited. She did not know whether she was moving forward. Perhaps she was only stamping her feet up and down on the same spot. Nothing changed in that white immensity around her. Would it ever change? She was like an ant crawling over a white table, a hard, bright, lustrous, enameled table. She threw her arms wide, suddenly feeling the space around her. She looked up at the sky. She looked, her head and shoulders thrown back, those twinkling splinters above. They were endless worlds, people said. Wasn't there room for her in the world? Who was moving her feet off the small space they held in the vast universe? Who were they, and why were they doing it? She had forgotten. She had to get out. Those legs were not hers any longer. They moved like a wheel, like levers, rising, bending, falling up and down with the jerks that reverberated up to her scalp. She felt suddenly that she was not tired. She had no pain. She was light and free, and she was well, too well. She could walk like this through years to come. Then a sudden jolt of pain shot through her shoulder blades, and she wavered, and she felt as if hours went by while a motionless leg rose the space of an atom at a time, and fell down again, cutting the snow, and she was walking again. She bent, her arms huddled over her stomach, drawing herself into a little ball so that her legs would have less to carry. Somewhere there was a border and it had to be crossed, she thought, suddenly, of a restaurant she had seen, for the flash of a second, in a German film. It had a sign over the door with plain, thin letters, nickel plated letters, insolent in their simplicity, on dull white glass: Cafe Diggy Daggy. They had no signs like that in the country she was leaving. They had no pavement lustrous as a ballroom floor. She repeated senselessly, without hearing the sounds, as a charm, as a prayer: Cafe Diggy Daggy. cafe, tigi, taggi. And she tried to walk in rhythm with the syllables. She did not have to tell her legs to move any longer. She thought they were running. An instinct was driving her, the instinct of an animal, wiping her blindly into the whipping her blindly into the battle of self-preservation. She was whispering through frozen lips, "You are a good soldier, Kira Argonova. You are a good soldier." Ahead of her, the blue snow billowed dimly against the sky. The waves did not change as she came closer. They stood out, sharper, harder, low hill, undulating in the darkness. White cones rose to the sky with black edges of branches. Then she saw a black figure. The figure was moving. It was moving in a straight line across the hills, across the horizon. She saw the legs like scissors opening and closing. She saw a small black spike on his shoulder and it gleamed sharply once against the sky. She fell down on her stomach. She felt dimly as though anesthetic, snow biting the wrist under her sleeves, rolling into her boots. She lay still, her heart pounding against the snow. Then she raised her head a little and crawled slowly forward on her stomach. She stopped and lay still, watching the black figure in the distance, and crawled again and stopped and watched and crawled again. Citizen Ivan Ivanov was 6 feet tall. He had a wide mouth and a short nose, and when he was puzzled, he blinked, scratching his neck. Citizen Ivan Ivanov was born in the year 1900s in a basement in a side street of the town of Vitebsk. He was the ninth child of the family. At the age of 6, he started in as apprentice to a shoemaker. The shoemaker beat him with leather suspenders and fed him buckwheat gruel. At the age of 10, he made his first pair of shoes all by himself and he wore them proudly down the street, the leather squeaking. That was the first day citizen Ivan Ivanov remembered all through his life. At the age of 15, he lured the neighborhood's grocer's daughter into a vacant lot and raped her. She was 12 years old, with a chest as flat as a boy's, and she whined shrilly. He made her promise not to tell anyone. He gave her 15 kopecks in a pound of sugar candy. That was the second day he remembered. At the age of 16, he made his first pair of military boots for a real general and he polished them thoroughly, spitting on the flannel rag, and he delivered them to the general himself, who patted him on the shoulder and gave him a tip of a ruble. That was the third day he remembered. There was a gay bunch of fellows around the shoemaker's shop. They rose at dawn and they worked hard and their shirts stuck to their backs with sweat, but they had a good time at night. There was a saloon in the corner of the street and they sang gay songs, their arms about one another's shoulders. There was a house around the corner where a wizened little man played the piano, and Ivan's favorite was a fat blonde in a pink kimono. She was a foreigner called Gretchen. And those were the nights citizen Ivan Ivanov remembered. He served in the Red Army and shells roaring overhead, made bets on lice races with the soldiers in the bottom of the trench. He was wounded and told he would die. He stared dully at the wall, for it did not make any difference. He recovered and married a servant girl with round cheeks and round breasts because he had gotten her in trouble. Their son was blond and husky and they named him Ivan. They went to church on Sundays and his wife cooked onions with roasted mutton when they could get it. She raised her skirt high over her fat legs and knelt and scrubbed the white pine floors of their rooms, and she sent him to a public bath once every month, and citizen Ivan Ivanov was happy. Then he was transferred to the border patrols, and his wife went back to live with her parents in the village and took their son with her. Citizen Ivan Ivanov had never learned to read. Citizen Ivan Ivanov was guarding the border of the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. He walked slowly through the snow, his rifle on his shoulder, blowing at his frozen fingers, crushing the cold. He did not mind going down the hill, but going uphill was hard, and he scrambled, groaning, to stand there alone on the summit, with the wind biting his nose and not a living soul for miles around. Then citizen Ivan Ivanov saw something moving in the snow far away. He was not sure it had moved. He peered into the darkness, but the wind raised whirls of snow dust over the plain, and he thought he might have been mistaken. Only it had seemed as if something had moved, which was not snow dust. He yelled, cupping his hands over his mouth. "Who goes there?" Nothing answered. Nothing moved in the plain under the hill. He yelled, "You'd better come out or I'll shoot." There was no answer. He hesitated, scratching his neck. He stared far out into the night, but he had to be safe. Citizen Ivan Ivanov raised his rifle to his shoulder and fired. A blue flame streaked through the darkness and a dull echo rolled in the distance, far away. There was no sound after the echo had died, no movement in the white plain under the hill. Citizen Ivan Ivanov scratched his neck. He should go down there and investigate, he thought, but it was too far, and snow was too deep, and the wind was too cold. He waved his hand and turned away. Just a rabbit, most likely, he muttered, descending the hill to continue his route. Kira Arganova lay very still in the snow, on her stomach, her arms thrown forward, and only a lock of her hair moved, falling from under the white kerchief, and her eyes followed the black figure walking away across the hills, disappearing in the distance. She lay still for a long time, watching a red spot widening slowly under her in the snow. She thought clearly, sharply, in words she could almost hear. "Well, I'm shot. Well, that's how it feels to be shot. It's not so frightful, is it?" She rose slowly to her knees. She took off a mitten and slipped her hand into her jacket to find the roll of bills over her left breast. She hoped the bullet that had not gone through the bills. It hadn't. The little hole in the jacket was just under them, and her fingers felt something hot and sticky. It did not hurt much. It felt like a sharp, sharp little burn in her side, with less pain than in her tired legs. She tried to stand up. She swayed a little, but she could stand. There was a dark patch on her jacket, and the fur was drawn into red, warm clusters. It did not bleed much, just a few drops she could feel slithering down her skin. She could walk. She would keep her hand on it, and it would not bleed. She was not far from the border now. Over there, beyond, she would have it, bandaged. It was not serious, and she could stand it. She had to go on. She staggered forward and wondered at the weakness in her knees. She whispered to herself through lips that were turning blue, "Of course, you are wounded and you are a little weak. That's to be expected. Nothing to worry about." Swaying, her shoulders drooping forward, her hand at her side, she went on through the snow, stumbling, her knees meeting, faltering as if she were drunk. She watched little dark drops falling off the hem of her lace gown. Slowly, once in a while, the drops stopped falling. She smiled. She felt no pain. The last of her consciousness had gone into one will, into two legs that were growing weaker and weaker. She had to go on. She had to get out. She had to get out. She whispered to herself as if the sound of her voice were a living fluid giving her strength. "You're a good soldier, Kira Argonova. You're a good soldier, and now's the time to prove it. Now, just one effort, one last effort. It's not so very bad yet, is it? You can make it. Just walk. Please, walk. You have to get out. Get out. Get out. Get out." She pressed her hand to the roll of bills in her jacket. She could not lose that. She had to watch that. She could not see things clearly any longer. She had to remember that. Her head was drooping forward. She closed her eyes, leaving slits open between her lashes to watch her legs that should not stop. She opened her eyes suddenly to find herself lying in the snow. She raised her head slowly, wondering for what she did not remember having fallen. She must have fainted, she thought, wondering curiously how it felt to faint, for she did not remember. It took a long time to rise. She noticed a red spot in the snow where she had fallen. She must have lain there for some time. She staggered forward, then stopped, some thought forming itself slowly in her dull eyes, and she came back and covered the red spot with snow with her foot. She went on, wondering dimly why the weather had become so hot and why the snow did not melt when it was so hot that she could hardly breathe. And what if the snow did melt? She would have to swim then. Well, she was a good swimmer, and that would be easier than walking, for her legs could rest then. She went reeling forward. She did not know whether she was walking in the right direction. She had forgotten that she had to think of a direction. She remembered only that she had to walk. She did not notice that the hill ended sharply on the edge of a ravine, and she fell and rolled down the white slope in a whirl of legs, arms, and snow. She could move nothing but one hand at first to rub the wet snow off her face, off her lips, off her frozen lashes. She lay huddled in a white heap on the bottom of a white gulch, The time it took to rise again seemed like hours, like years. Just to draw her hand to her body at first, palms down to press her elbows to her body, turn her legs, push her feet out, then rise to her knees, leaning on tense, trembling arms and breathe with a breath like a knife inside, then rise a little further, leaning on one hand, then tear that hand too off the snow and rise and stand erect, panting. She made a few steps, but she could not walk up the other side of the gulch. She felt and crawled up the hill on her hands and knees, digging her burning face into the snow to cool her cheeks. She rose to her feet again on the top of the hill. She had lost her mittens. She felt something in the corners of her mouth and she rubbed her lips and looked at her fingers. Her fingers were pink with froth. She felt too hot. She tore the white scarf off her hair and threw it down into the gulch. The wind was a relief. Blowing her hair back in a straight, shivering line, she went on, raising her face to the wind. She felt too hot and it was so difficult to breathe. She tore off her fur jacket and dropped it into the snow and went on, without looking back. In the sky, the clouds were rolling away in whirls of blue and grey and dark green. Ahead of her, above the snow, a pale line glowed, rising, and it was a transparent white. But above the snow, it looked like a very pale green. She pitched forward and jerked back again, brushing the hair out of her eyes, and faltered, and went on, a trembling, swaying, reeling, drunken figure in a long wedding gown of lace white as the snow around her. The train was torn off her waistline and it dragged behind her, her legs getting tangled in the long lace. She staggered blindly, the wind waving her hair, her arms swinging as if they too were loose in the wind. She leaned back and her breast stood out under the white lace, and from under her left breast a little stream of red trickled down slowly, and long dark patches spread down to the train, and delicate flowers of lace were red on the white satin. And suddenly her dry lips, caked and sealed with froth, opened again, and she called softly one name as a plea for help, from over there, from across the border, as a caress, her voice tender and almost joyous. Leo. She repeated louder and louder without despair, as if the sound, that one sound in the world, were giving her life. Leo! 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 She was calling him. The Leo that could have been, that would have been had he lived there, where she was going across the border. He was awaiting her there, and she had to go on. She had to walk. There in that world across the border, a life was waiting for her to which she had been faithful, her every living hour, her only banner that had never been lowered, that she had held high and straight, a life she could not betray. She would not betray now by stopping while she was still living, a life she could still serve by walking forward a little longer, just a little longer. Then she heard a song, a tune not loud enough to be a human sound, a song as a last battle march, and it was not a funeral dirge, it was not a hymn, it was not a prayer, it was a tune from an old operetta, the song of broken glass. Little notes of music trembled in hesitation and burst and rolled in quick, fine waves. Like the thin, clear ringing of glass, little notes leaped and laughed with a full, unconditional, consummate human joy. She did not know whether she was singing. Perhaps she was only hearing the music somewhere. But the music had been a promise at the dawn of her life. That which had been promised then could not be denied to her now. She had to go on. She went on, a fragile girl in the flowing medieval gown of a priestess, red satins, red stains spreading on the white lace. At dawn, she fell on the edge of the slope. She lay very still, for she knew that she could not rise again. Far down below her, an endless snow plain stretched into the sunrise. The sun had not come. A band of pink, pale and young, like the like the birth of a color, rose over the snow and glowed, trembling, flowing up into a blue immensity of sparks twinkling under a thin veil, like the faint, fading ghost of a lake in a summer sun, like the still surface of a lake with the sun drowned far in its depth. And the snow, at the rise of that liquid flame, seemed to quiver, breathing, glittering softly. Long bands stretched across the plain, shadows that seemed light itself. A heavier, bluer light with edges ready to burst into dancing fires. A lonely little tree stood far away in the plain. It had no leaves, its slim, rare twigs had gathered no snow. It stretched, tense with the life of a future spring, thin black branches like arms into the dawn rising over an endless earth where so much had been possible. She lay on the edge of a hill and looked down at the sky. One hand, white and still, hung over the edge, and little red drops rolled slowly in the snow down the slope. She smiled. She knew she was dying, but it did not matter any longer. She had known something which no human words could ever tell, and she knew it now. She had been awaiting it, and she felt it, as if it had been, as if she had lived it. Life had been, if only because she had known it could be. And she felt it now as a hymn without sound, deep under the little hole that dripped red drops into the snow, deeper than that from which the red drops came. A moment or an eternity. Did it matter? Life, undefeated, existed and could exist. She smiled, her last smile, to so much that had been possible. Well, that ended sadly, but then with hope. Okay, this is afterword, which we won't read. If you want to read, like you can write in the comment section, and I would upload a reading of this afterwards. But it is more about Anne Rand and how she came up to this writing, and it might also mention why it is also called a semi autobiography of Ayn Rand. But yeah, okay, that brings us to the end of the chapter and of the book, We the Living by Ayn Rand. It was sad, but it highlights very nicely the individualistic culture and the collectivistic culture. Um, well, if you have any kind of comments, any feedback, anything at all, even recommendations for future readings, suggestions, all are welcome. You can write down in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section of the YouTube channel. Bye bye for now. Keep reading. And if you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe, like, and share. Bye.